Welcome into another Q&A, questions and alcohol, and this time there is a little bit of questions about alcohol, but as we talk about on this show, we talk about food, art, alcohol in Kentucky and beyond, and I think this next topic is going to cover a lot of those in a fun way. We're joined by Albert W.A. Schmid. Did I say Schmid right?
You did.
Awesome,
you got
awesome,
it.
awesome. I was practicing because, like I told you before, once I hit the record button, you never know. He is an author, executive chef, and educator, and his most recent book is Burgoo, Barbecue, and Bourbon, a Kentucky Culinary Trinity. Albert, thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Now, as I was looking up, I don't want to, age you at all, but you have a little bit of experience, as a chef and so forth. Can you talk about that experience and just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I've been extremely fortunate. I started in high school, and this was just a high school job. It was one of those things that you do while you're in high school. And I was a candy maker. So I was working for a company in San Antonio, Texas. And then, long story short, my father was a Presbyterian minister, and he got a call to a church in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I was, going from high school to college, and I was reclassified in college as an out-of-state student, even though I had never left the state. And so I was stateless. And so I moved up to Nebraska. And actually, I really was stateless because Texas didn't want to recognize that I was a Texas citizen. When I got to Nebraska, I found out that I couldn't enter the University of Nebraska without sitting out for a while because I had not lived there. And so I was without state. And so I went to work, and I basically took my knowledge of candy making with me to Nebraska, and then sort of evolved into a baker, and then, just kept working. And it has taken me around the world to many different countries. I've cooked in London, in Britain, and I've also done it in a lot of states. So it's been a wonderful ride. Fantastic.
Well, and you also enjoy writing, and I was able to read through Burgoo, Barbecue, and Bourbon a little bit before we chatted. What can folks expect with this book? Because I feel like it's pretty interesting how you kind of approach it and all the information you give.
Oh, I'll tell you what, this started off as a really small project. It was just going to be a book on Burgoo. And what I realized very quickly is that it sort of expanded beyond that because Burgoo goes with barbecue, and then there are all the side dishes and the breads, and then there's bourbon drinks that can be had. And there's sort of a connection to Kentucky politics. And so that's sort of how the book came together. It also came together because Western Kentucky University was gifted a very large number of regional cookbooks. And I want to say it was something to the effect of like 2,400 cookbooks. And I had been down to Western Kentucky to guest lecture. I was friends with, and still am friends with, several professors there, including one of the people who was a professor at the library. And he called and said, could you come down here and look at these books and see if we should keep them or sell them? And so I went down and I reviewed the books. I spent a very long weekend in their library, just going through the collection, and it was absolutely amazing. Some of these cookbooks, some of them were extremely rare, probably, only had a run of 250 copies. And so, but as I was flipping through the cookbooks, I was finding recipes that I had never seen before, and that were a little dated, or meaning that they were from the 50s or 60s or 70s. And I thought, that actually sounds good. And so, that was also part of what brought this project together.
And then for those that are unfamiliar, what is Burgoo?
Okay, so Burgoo, for those who are familiar with barbecue, um, if you're familiar with what Brunswick stew is, it's similar to that, but um, and I can get into where the word Burgoo comes from, but basically it is a version of Brunswick stew that's very soupy instead of stewy. And so, and to be more specific, it has to have um, a bird from the air and a beast from the field. So it can also vary greatly.
Mm.
You can have, theoretically, you could use turkey and beef, or you could use chicken and pork, and they're still burgoos, but they would be very different.
And then the name, I just feel like it's a, it's one of those food types that if you're in an area that it's kind of runs rampant, you're probably very familiar. If you're not, you're going, what in the world? And then you're like, how do you say this word? Where does it come from?
Right, right. So let's see, Burgoo, it's actually, at least the research that I did, sort of pinned it down to sort of an kind of an oatmeal-like stew that was used by the British. And and then there are several other possibilities for that. A town in West Virginia. I was recently looking at a map of Spain, and there's a town, Burgos. It's Burgos. So it's really close. And I was thinking, is there a connect? And of course, I don't know that there is, but I just thought that was very interesting. So, but I think it's from the British sailing ships, where they would do an oatmeal porridge kind of stew, and they just borrowed the name.
Uh, it's always interesting to see where things come from. And, in the book, you kind of give an overview history of a lot of the different parts. You talk about the burgoo, barbecue, bread, dessert sides, even the bourbon. Um, why kind of go with that history overview and then some recipes? Why kind of give that fun background? Because some of it is a little more fun than maybe others.
Right, right. Well, I think one of the interesting things about, the United States, as young as it is, and I say as young as it is, relatively speaking, it's a young country, but it has some really rich and interesting history. And I think that the food that we eat is tied to that history, and you can't separate the two. For example, barbecue. When you start talking about barbecue, um, depends on where you're at, on what it is. So I grew up in Texas. So for me, brisket, that is barbecue. But I've also lived near Kansas City. And so there's a rich sauce that goes with that. I've also lived in North Carolina. And you actually have two traditions in North Carolina. But Kentucky has its tradition too, and it came out of a particular thing. So understanding the history is super important to understanding why Kentucky has its barbecue tradition and why it's different from everywhere else.
Well, and I mean, depending on who you ask, Owensboro likes to claim that they're the barbecue capital of the world.
Of the world, right? Absolutely.
And when you were finding recipes, where did those recipes come from? Did they come from some of those books that you were kind of looking through? Were they some that you already kind of had known? Because there's like you said, there's some kind of maybe modern ones, and then some older ones, historical ones.
Right. So it started off with, and I was traveling regularly down to Western Kentucky. The thought process was my work schedule in Louisville. I had half days on Fridays, and so I would leave um, as soon as I got off work, and I would travel down to Bowling Green, and I would spend the night. A professor friend, Wes Berry, put me up at his house. And then what I would do is in the morning, I would go in and I would go to the library and I would report in and start researching. That lasted just a short period of time. And the reason is because the state was working on some money saving measures. And so they started closing the libraries on Saturday. So I didn't have that. So I started ordering books, sort of trying to replace, and I was looking for specific titles. I was able to find them. And so I built my own little library. So I sort of a combination between the two, having access to Western Kentucky University's library, and then also building my own library and being able to research this. And it was fascinating because you can see sort of an evolution of certain recipes, especially the barbecue. And Wes Berry, who wrote the book on Kentucky barbecue, he and I had this discussion about how it used to be this one thing, whole meat and, a marinade and kind of a sauce, and it sort of devolved into ground beef. And you see that in the book. And that's kind of there's sort of a revival of the old way of making barbecue, but there is that sort of, you see that in the book, where people are starting to use ground beef, and it's valid, but I don't know that it was barbecue per se.
I was gonna say I enjoyed talking to Wes about some of his books, and for those looking, you can go to our website, find it hopspirits.com, that Q&A. When you're researching a book like this and you're able to find some of those older recipes, those almost in a sense lost recipes, how much fun is that for you to be able to give those kind of new life, and also just probably searching for them? I mean, that's kind of like, a treasure hunter's dream is to find some of those.
It is. So, I mean, so you have the recipes that you're absolutely looking for, but then you have some surprises. And there was one recipe in particular where I was flipping through the book and I was just reading the titles of the recipes, and I flipped the page and went, ooh, and closed that book and went to the next one. And then I found a similar recipe. So I went back to the first book, opened it up, sort of marked the page, had the second book, and then it sort of ended up being a pile of books that featured this one recipe. And then it was taking all of those recipes, finding the recipe, but it was okay, but I wanted to get it to a different place. And so we sort of did 4 or 5 different batches where we were trying to manipulate the recipe on the culinary end, because this recipe, and it's Pinto Bean Pie. And by Pinto Bean Pie, I'm not talking about an appetizer. I'm definitely talking about a dessert. Okay. And when I first saw that, I was like, ooh. And
I could see that.
Yeah. And it was not, I can't, I mean, beans are great. I love burritos and I love, bean dip, but I would never ever have considered it to be a dessert. So anyway, it turns out it's very similar to like a pumpkin pie or a sweet potato pie, and really you can't tell the difference. And what I mean is if I just presented you a piece, you would say, oh, this has a little bit darker color than pumpkin pie, but it tastes very much like pumpkin pie. And it has that custard kind of filling. What we manipulated was, when we baked it, there was this crust that would form on the top. And what I wanted it to be more like was more like a pumpkin pie, where it was more of a custard kind of. And so that's what we, and I worked with a group of chefs, including just an incredible master chef whose name is David Dodd, who was my boss at Sullivan University at the time. And he now lives in Indiana. And, we went back and forth and talked about how to adjust the recipe so that it would end up in the final form the way we wanted it to end up. So
that sounds like
anyway,
a lot of fun. I mean, would you do that with a lot of the recipes that to make sure that they were actually doable? Like people could produce them?
Absolutely. And that's the goal. I think that should be the goal of any cookbook, is when you write down a recipe. It doesn't necessarily have to be yours. And I was very careful to cite, I got this recipe from this particular cookbook. But I think it's important to, when you're trying to create something, that it can be duplicated by the person reading the book. Because I have several cookbooks where I've tried to recreate it, and I think, oh my gosh, I've been a professional for a very long time in the kitchen. If I can't recreate this, I don't know how anybody could. So I feel like it's important to make sure that you have that.
And while you're not in Kentucky now, like you said, you worked in Louisville at Sullivan University for a good while, almost 2 decades. What keeps drawing you back to write about the state and its foods and things like that?
Well, so it boils down to this. It boils down to the fact that you can take the boy out of Kentucky, but you cannot take the love for the state or the Commonwealth out of the boy. And we have family, friends, many friends there, and we are up there regularly. The other thing is that, and I guess, if somebody's not going to help safeguard Kentucky cuisine, because things evolve. Recently I went to a Korean restaurant that's down here in Florida, and the food is good, and it's run by somebody from Korea. And I had this discussion with them, and they basically said, yeah, we had to eventually dumb down the food so that the Americans would eat it. And so you see this sort of evolution of authentic Korean food into something that Americans will approach. And I felt that way about this book and about Kentucky cuisine. Kentucky has some really amazing creations. The hot brown is one of them. Love it or hate it, geta from Northern Kentucky. And other dishes. And I just felt like we have to keep this as authentic as possible. So.
And you write a lot of books, or have written a lot of books, mostly right in your wheelhouse, food and alcohol. Why those books? I mean, I know obviously you're a chef and things like that, but I mean, even the cocktail books, I feel like that just interesting strategy there. Unless you just enjoyed the research is what I'll call it.
The research, right. So I guess when I did my first book was a textbook on wines, beers, and spirits. And the way that I approached writing that book was, when I was teaching the class Wines, Beers, and Spirits, we had this book, and no offense to the book, great book. It was about this thick, okay, and it had 36 chapters and an entire alphabet of appendices. And one day I was lecturing in class, and I just offhandedly asked the students, are you guys even cracking the book? And they were like, no, we buy the book, but it's so intimidating, we don't even really read it. And so my thought was, is there a way to distill, no pun intended, this book down into a, something that is approachable to the students? And that's what I did with that first book. So then I already had the cooking experience. Then I have this. Then I ran across a little book by Colonel Joe Nickel, on the mint julep. And I felt that it was important. I thought they did one on the mint julep. Maybe they'll do one on the old fashioned. And so I approached the University Press of Kentucky and said, you published this other book. How about this, book on the old fashioned? They said, they gave me the green light for it. And then I also produced the Kentucky Bourbon Cookbook, and those were about the same time. And so we had the food and the liquor, and then it just sort of went from there. And so that sort of gave me, I guess, street cred on being able to write about food and about cocktails, and and the research has been absolutely fantastic.
I was gonna say there's nothing wrong with being able to do a little bit of research on that. I mean, when you think back to Burgoo, barbecue, and bourbon, were there any recipes or things that really just stood out to you? Maybe one or two across the book that just when you found them, it was awesome, and when you made it, it was maybe even better.
Woodford pudding, which has nothing to do with Woodford Reserve. Woodford Reserve is a wonderful bourbon, but this really refers to the county. And so the Woodford pudding, that's something that anytime that I'm able to make that anywhere that I am, I recently made it here in Tallahassee, Florida. I did a cooking class on how to cook with bourbon, and I featured Woodford pudding, which has no bourbon in it, but had a bourbon sauce that went on top of it. So that recipe in particular. But there were some bread recipes that I came across. One, if people have, they buy Bisquick to make biscuits. There's a recipe for a Bisquick type product that you can make ahead, and then all you have to do is just like you would Bisquick, but you're making it yourself. So, but then also the desserts. I wouldn't have originally recommended the Pinto Bean Pie, but I do recommend that. So, but also just looking at how things have evolved in Kentucky cuisine. So,
I was gonna say I really enjoyed it because especially just seeing one getting that history. Some were a little shorter, some were a little longer on the backgrounds, which makes sense based on what the categories were. But to have all of that in such a very digestible format and one that you can kind of flip through, mark the pages you want, I really enjoyed it. And before I let you go, what's next for you? What are you doing now? And you got any new books or any ideas coming out?
absolutely. So I have a book that I'm working on with the University Press of Kentucky, and it's like Bourbon 101. And so, for those people who want to get into bourbon but don't really know where to start, and basically it's Bourbon 101. It's bourbon in 10 short lessons. And so it's a short book. It's not a huge book, but it's something to get people, sort of give them a launching point. The interesting part about this book is that it actually has a lot of memories for me in my interactions with master distillers from Kentucky. So I was not originally a bourbon drinker, and it had nothing to do with the fact that I didn't like bourbon. It had to do with I'm allergic to corn, and I mistakenly, just knowing what bourbon was made out of, made the assumption, well, if it's made out of corn, I really should stay away from it. Lincoln Henderson, who was at Brown Forman at the time and eventually went to opened Angel's Envy, was the one who turned that for me. So I was at a professional conference in 2003 in San Diego. We ran into each other through a mutual friend. He offered to buy a glass of bourbon. And I said, oh, I can't do it because I'm allergic to corn. And he said, what you're allergic to is distilled out in the process. So tonight you're drinking bourbon. And so I haven't looked back since. So that's one. But then after the Kentucky Bourbon Cookbook, I found myself speaking on panels with Jimmy Russell and Chris Morris and Parker Beam, Craig Beam, Susan Ringler, Peggy No Stevenson, Fred
them,
No,
yes.
and Fred Minnick. And so it was interesting. I was on those panels because I was the expert on cooking with it. And one of the best things for me was to sit on those panels and to absorb all of the expertise. Mike Veach, I forgot Mike Veach, and how can you forget that man? I was absorbing everything that they were saying. And so the new book is really focused on the lessons that I learned, and just passing those on and getting people excited about the spirit, the American spirit. So
I love it. I love it. So you have, is that going to be called the Kentucky Bourbon Cookbook 2, or is it 2.0, or what? Are you unsure yet?
okay, well, so the working title is Bourbon 101.
Okay. Also, it's all in Bourbon 101.
Right, it's all about bourbon.
Okay.
So, and it's getting somebody, somebody says, I think I want to start drinking bourbon. Great. This provides a roadmap of things that people should do, how to taste professionally. So you get a glass of bourbon, what's the first thing that you do with it? But then also talking about the differences in types of bourbon so that people can sort of move in that direction. Great example. Um, you know, the difference between my father and I reference that in the book. Um, so my father has been a bourbon drinker, was a bourbon drinker for many, many years. I remember uh, when we were living in New Orleans, Louisiana, and he handed, or well, he was drinking a glass of bourbon, rough day as a pastor, and he would always talk about 2 fingers of bourbon. I need, I'm going to have 2 fingers of bourbon. And so he poured it into the glass, and he was really good about letting me experience the world. And so I said, hey, can I have a taste of that? And he said, no, 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 this is an adult drink. I'll let you smell it. And so he let me smell it, and it put that on my radar. And anyway, he liked wheated bourbons.
Okay.
So, and what we came to find out later is I like more of a classic recipe or more of a rye. It's not that if somebody hands me a glass of Maker's Mark, I'll drink it. Okay.
You're not saying no.
I'm not saying no. And Old Fitzgerald's fantastic too. But for my taste, I like things with a lot of flavor. So I usually tend to gravitate towards the rye bourbons or the classic recipes of bourbon. But that's an important distinction, so that, and I think that everybody should have at least 3 bottles of bourbon. Okay. 1 classic recipe, 1 rye, and 1 wheated bourbon. And then that way, anybody who comes over, you can enjoy a glass of bourbon, regardless of what their tastes are.
Well, that sounds like an awesome book, and pulling from all those folks who I've gotten to talk to, some of them on the podcast, or the various podcasts, and others I've just gotten to admire from afar. So that sounds like a great group to pull knowledge from, along with just the knowledge and the history that you have. And for those wanting to find out more, albertschmid.com, also on social media, Albert. And the book is out as well. Burgoo, Barbecue, and Bourbon. You can find his other books as well. Albert, this was so much fun and so informative. I appreciate it.
Oh, you bet. My pleasure.